Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Luke chapter 23. Jesus has been abandoned and betrayed, condemned to die by the Sanhedrin Council. It's not fair, it's wrong, it's corrupt, it's unjust. But Jesus doesn't say anything. He submits to it all. Through all the corruption and evil that is thrust upon him in this chapter, Jesus stays true to his Father's vision, loving his enemies, forgiving those who are actively persecuting him. Many people mock Jesus, but others, even now, believe in him. And through the fulfillment of many prophecies, we see that it's now, through Jesus' death, that God is arriving on earth and bringing his kingdom and his messianic king with him. Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." So Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "It is as you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and to the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they kept on insisting, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place." When Pilate heard it, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. After all of the sabotage and slander, the chief priests finally feel that they can make a case to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea at that time. Now, we know the kind of brutal tyrant Pilate is because of how he executed the insurrectionists from Galilee. Luke 13 says he mixed their blood with the blood of the sacrifices that they were offering in the temple. And the Jews want him to do something similar with Jesus. That's why they present him as an insurrectionist, stirring up the people. They say that he taught people to ignore paying Roman taxes, even though that's pretty explicitly the opposite of what he said in Luke 20. And then they say that Jesus has presented himself to be the Christ, or the Messiah, which means the Anointed One. This was a royal king figure established in Old Testament prophecies like Psalm 2, 110, and 2 Samuel 7. And Jesus doesn't deny his kingship for a second. After all, he's been teaching about the arrival of his kingdom all throughout Luke's gospel. But at first, it doesn't work. Pilate doesn't really care who Jesus thinks he is, and so he decides that Jesus hasn't done anything deserving punishment. When Pilate hears that he's from Galilee, he takes that as an opportunity to pawn Jesus off to Herod, the tetrarch of that region. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. And here we have a piece of information that is exclusive to Luke's gospel. We know that Herod has been very interested in Jesus and his ministry. At one point, he thought he was John the Baptist raised from the dead, according to Luke 9. Herod wants to see some sort of miracle or sign from Jesus, and he's in a position of authority that could easily help Jesus get acquitted. If Jesus plays the game here, if he does a few magic tricks to appease Herod, he could very easily get himself released. But Jesus doesn't say anything. He refuses that temptation just like he did in Luke 4. He could inherit the kingdoms of all the world for a temporary amount of time, but he knows that if he does it God's way, he will inherit the eternal kingdom of God. Of course, that means persecution and humiliation and suffering. And so Jesus is mocked and beaten by Herod's crew and sent back to Pilate as a fraud. Herod even dresses Jesus up as a faux king to drive the point home. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him. But they cried out all together, saying, Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas. He was one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city, and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept calling out, saying, Crucify, crucify him. And he said to them the third time, Why, what evil has this man done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death, therefore I will punish him and release him. But they were insistent, with loud voices, asking that he be crucified. And their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced sentence that their demand would be granted. And he released the man they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder. But he delivered Jesus into their will. Still, Pilate insists that Jesus has done nothing deserving capital punishment. He offers to release Jesus, but the crowd demands that he release Barabbas, who actually was an insurrectionist. The people want someone like Barabbas who will take action, someone who will fight the Romans and stir up controversy and start wars and arm civilians and get people killed. And it's the exact type of violent revolution that Jesus has been opposed to. He said time after time that it will lead to the destruction of Jerusalem, and we know from history that he's right. These types of rebellions led to the Jewish-Roman wars, the first of which in AD 70 destroyed not only Jerusalem, but burnt the temple to the ground. Nevertheless, the crowd demands that Jesus be crucified. They want to see his public, humiliating execution. And Pilate, instead of doing the thing he knows to be right, even though he has the authority to do it, he gives in to the pressure and knowingly condemns an innocent man to die, which is, of course, exactly what Jesus said was going to happen. When they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. And following him was a large crowd of the people, and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? Jesus is led to his death, so beaten and bruised that they have to enlist a man named Simon to carry his cross for him. And yet, even now, Jesus is weeping and warning people of the destruction of the city. He quotes Hosea 10, knowing that eventually Jerusalem's sin will catch up with them in the form of wars and destruction and death. And him being led to his death is the exact type of sin and corruption of justice that will lead to these days of judgment. But on top of it all, Jesus knows that him going through towards his death is the only way for anyone to be rescued from it. Two others also, who were criminals, were being led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. But Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves. And the people stood by, looking on. And even the rulers were sneering at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if this is the Christ of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. Now there was also an inscription above him, This is the King of the Jews. Jesus is nailed to a cross, strung up to die, slowly suffocating over the course of hours, while the whole time the crowd sits and watches and mocks him as a false Messiah. Images from Psalm 22 become manifest when people gamble for Jesus' clothes, some of his only possessions he had in life. And the cognitive dissonance here would be very evident for Luke's original audience. Here's Jesus, literally labeled the Messiah, the King of the Jews, and he's being crucified by the Romans. He must not be that big of a deal after all. And yet it's in Jesus submitting to death and suffering that he really does become enthroned as the King of the cosmos. He is not just the King of the Jews, but of all creation. It's just that that's not evident yet. What is evident? Jesus' overwhelming message of grace and forgiveness. In the midst of all of this, from on his own cross, he calls for God to forgive those who are executing him. Once again, practicing exactly what he preached about loving one's enemies. One of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, and rebuking him, said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." While all four Gospels make note of two criminals that were executed on either side of Jesus, Luke alone gives us the details of the conversation that happened between the crucified trio. One of the criminals mocks Jesus in the same way that the crowds were doing. Yeah, you can't really be the Messiah at all, because if you were, you would save yourself. But notice that that unbelieving criminal also wants to be saved. That is, he wants to be delivered and rescued from the pain of the crucifixion that he's currently experiencing. On the other side, though, is a criminal who recognizes the justice he and his compatriot are receiving versus the injustice that Jesus is receiving. He agrees that they broke the law, and they knew that the punishment for that would be death, but they still went through with whatever it was that got them here. Jesus, meanwhile, is completely innocent. And the criminal that realizes this doesn't ask to be saved from crucifixion. He asks to be remembered in Jesus' new kingdom. It's a statement of faith, showing his belief in Jesus as God's appointed Messiah. It also implies his belief that God will raise Jesus from the dead and enthrone him with heavenly dominion. And so Jesus' statement from earlier about how those who seek to gain their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for his sake will gain it, holds true. Because Jesus promises that the believing thief, in spite of all of the sin and evil he's committed, he will enter into paradise with Jesus on the same day. And this word for paradise is with a capital P. This is not the English concept of a Hawaiian beach on a postcard or your back porch early in the morning. It actually comes from a Persian word which means an enclosed park or garden. And it's the same Greek word that in the Septuagint is used to describe the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 and 2. And, as also backed up by Revelation 2, we see that this biblical paradise is where the tree of God's life is. Jesus is talking about this criminal entering into new creation, into a reconciled relationship with God. It was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, because the sun was obscured, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. As Jesus dies, he quotes from Psalm 31, completely giving up his spirit into God's will. And as that happens, darkness covers the land and an earthquake erupts, so powerful that it splits the veil that's in the temple right down the middle. These are just like the signs that Jesus alluded to in Luke 21. And it's an illustration made manifest of all of the Old Testament prophetic language that described the arrival of God's kingdom. Think about passages like Exodus 10, the plague of darkness right before Passover, when the Israelites were liberated from slavery. Of course, that would mean that in the slot of the Passover lamb is Jesus, which he alluded to in Luke 9 and 22. And on top of that, there are many other scriptural passages like Isaiah 13 and 14, Ezekiel 32, and Joel 2 that all use the image of the sun and moon and stars being darkened. God is limiting the powers of the creation he made in Genesis 1 and 2 so that he can remake a new creation out of it. Now, the importance of the veil being torn is that the temple was where God lived, right? It was his house. And behind the veil was his throne room, so to speak. It was where the concentrated presence of his glorious spirit resided. And so when the veil was torn, that meant that God's Spirit left the temple and began to indwell in the hearts of his people, just as God promised to do, both in Joel 2 and in Numbers 11, Ezekiel 36, and Zechariah 12. It's all just like Jesus said, and we get a small earth-side glimpse of what's happening in the heavens. The fulfillment of all of these prophecies doesn't come with war and with a violent revolution. It comes from one human who finally lived a life that was completely devoted to following God's will, submitting to him even in the face of brutal torture, humiliation, persecution, and ultimately death. Now, when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowds who came together for this spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance, seeing these things. Luke elaborates that while many people in Jerusalem mocked Jesus while he was dying, there are some who believe in him, specifically when all these signs start happening. Even a Roman centurion, who presumably just finished nailing Jesus to the cross, proclaims his innocence. Many people begin repenting of their sins, and the women from Galilee that Luke mentioned in chapter 8 all witness this from afar. They'll be important for what happens next, but the prevailing thought is, wow, this was an evil thing that was done. But now, it's too late. And a man named Joseph, who was a member of the council, a good and righteous man, he had not consented to their plan and action. A man from Arimathea, a city of the Jews, who was waiting for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And he took it down and wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid him in a tomb cut into the rock, where no one had ever been lain. It was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. Now the women who had come with him out of Galilee followed, and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes. And on the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment. Crucifixions in the first century Roman Empire were not rare, but burying the body of somebody who had been crucified was. Normally, these bodies were left hung up to rot on their crosses, decomposing over days and being picked at by birds and rats. It was a statement for all those passing by that this is what would happen to you if you ever dared to rebel against Rome. But there's one particular man named Joseph of Arimathea who has a little bit of money and a little bit of influence, and he actually believed in Jesus' teachings. He figures even though he was outvoted with sentencing Jesus to death, the least he could do was make sure his body got a proper burial. And this creates an opportunity for all the female disciples to donate their spices and oils and perfumes to embalm Jesus' body. They lay him in a tomb, seal it shut, and rest on the Sabbath, trying their best to just pretend it was any other week. Now this is where this chapter ends, but the finale of Luke's gospel will change everything. We see so much injustice and evil and mocking in Jesus' death. He's been betrayed and abandoned and beaten and tortured and ultimately is crucified, the most extreme and humiliating cause of death in his time. And Jesus bore it all for us, still warning of the judgment to come and asking God to forgive. Then those allusions to Old Testament prophecy happen through the eclipse and the earthquake, showing that somehow heaven is breaking onto earth through the death of Jesus. And somehow centurions and criminals are still coming to faith in him, believing in his innocence and in his authority. But as of right now, Jesus is dead. Thank God for what happened 3 days later. Thanks for watching 1189. I hope that you have a good day, and God bless.